Wyoming Territory, winter of 1887. The wind howled through the pines like a hungry coyote, dragging flurries of snow across the valley floor. On a lonely ridge stood a modest ranch house, its chimney coughing thin trails of smoke into a gray sky. The wooden porch creaked under the shifting frost. The land was still, save for the soft thud of approaching footsteps small. Unsure, an urgent dot, she could not have been more than 6 years old. Her boots were too big for her small feet, clearly a man's, and her coat was torn at the elbow, the sleeves hiding her trembling hands. She stared up at the thick cedar door as if it held the last chance in a world that had gone completely dark. With a fist balled and brave, she knocked. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind. Then, heavy footsteps from within. A latch clicked, a heavy, metallic sound. The door swung open. Silas Reed stood in the frame, a man as weathered as the mountains themselves. He was tall and broad-shouldered, unshaven from the long winter days spent in solitude. At 34, his eyes were the color of cold steel, and they held the quiet, haunted look of a man who had seen too much. He had once ridden with the cavalry, a respected captain, before leaving it all behind 6 years ago. His life now stretched only as far as the boundaries of his land and the profound silence of his house. But what stood before him now shattered that silence. A little girl, dirt smudged on her cheeks, her eyes wide, brown with flecks of amber like river stones. He left us. "Sir," she said, her voice a tiny, quivering thing against the vastness of the storm. "Mama said you might help." Silas blinked once, his mind struggling to process the scene. The girl sniffled, clutching something tightly to her chest, a worn piece of embroidered cloth. There was a dark, ugly stain on it. "Blood? Your mama?" he asked, the words scratching his throat, rough from disuse. "She's hurt bad. In the woods. She told me to find Mr. Reed. She said you'd know what to do." He crouched. To her level, his face tightening, the cold steel in his eyes sharpening. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Annabel," she whispered. "My mama's name is Amara." Silas froze. The name cut through him like a buried shard of glass. His lips parted, but no words came. It couldn't be. Not after all these years. "Please, sir," Annabel said, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling down her cold cheeks. "Mama said you're the only one who'd come." 1,000 thoughts crashed through him, a roaring tide of memory and pain. He hadn't heard that name in 7 years. Not since the day she had left town, vanished from his world like smoke on the plains, leaving only a cryptic, heartbreaking note. Silas looked past the girl out to the tree line, where the snow was falling thicker now, and the night was creeping in fast. "How far?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "Not far." I followed. "The river, just like she said. She's in a hollow, past the broken wagon wheel tree." That tree. He knew it. A forked elm, struck by lightning years back, a place they had once met in secret. He stood, his jaw clenching so tight it ached. "Come inside. You're freezing." Annabel shook her head, her small face a mask of desperate urgency. "She said not to wait. She's bleeding in her leg." She screamed when I touched it. Silas turned on his heel, his decision made in an instant. In one fluid motion he grabbed his heavy oilskin coat from a peg, his rifle from its rack, and a bedroll from a nearby chest. He tossed a thick wool blanket over the girl's small shoulders. "You're riding with me." She followed him down the steps, silent now, her wide eyes watching every move he made. He hoisted her onto his sturdy gelding, mounted up behind her, wrapping one arm around her small body, and kicked the animal into a gallop. The wind bit through his coat. The snow blurred his vision. But in his mind, there was only one thing now. Amara. As the horse charged down the ridge, Silas fought the storm, the cold, and the roaring tide of a past he had buried long ago. He had never stopped asking himself why she had left. But tonight, those answers would have to wait. She needed him. And this time, he would not be too late. The cold deepened as they rode, a palpable living thing that sought to steal the warmth from their bodies. Silas did not slow the horse. The wind stung their faces as the gelding climbed the frozen riverbed, its hooves cracking over the ice. He had wrapped Annabel in his oilskin coat, her small body pressed against his for warmth. She held the saddle horn tight, her silence absolute, her eyes locked forward, as if her focus alone could bring them to her mother faster. "Keep your head down," Silas said over the wind, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "We're close now. What did you mean by the wagon wheel tree?" She asked, her voice muffled by the coat. "It's a big one, split down the middle by lightning," he replied, his own words tasting like ash. "Mama said it would point the way." He knew the one. An old, lightning-struck elm on the North Ridge, a landmark for hunters and travelers. He'd once carved his initials into its trunk, right next to hers, a foolish, youthful promise etched into the living wood. He veered the horse off the main trail, pushing through the deep drifts. Night was falling fast, the gray sky turning to a deep, inky black. The heavy snowfall turned to a sharp, stinging sleet dot in the trees ahead. A low growl rippled through the air. Wolves. Silas reined in sharply, his hand instinctively going to the pistol at his hip. Annabel tensed against him. "Don't look," he murmured, his voice calm and steady. "They're hungry, but they won't follow us into this." Yellow eyes flashed briefly in the woods, but the looming storm was enough to keep them back. Then he saw her. A dark form slumped beneath the fallen branches of the wagon wheel tree. Torn fabric, a dark stain in the snow. He leaped down from the horse, before it had even stopped moving. "Stay here, Annabel." He dropped to his knees in the snow beside her. Amara. She lay half-buried, her dark hair frozen in icy clumps to the ground. A deep gash split her temple, and her lips were a pale, bloodless blue. The shoulder of her dress was soaked in a red that was almost black in the dim light. He pressed 2 cold fingers to her throat. A pulse. Still there, but faint, thready, a butterfly's wing against his skin. "Amara," he said, his voice breaking. "It's me. It's Silas. I've got you now." She stirred faintly at the sound of his voice, but did not wake. Her leg was twisted at an unnatural angle beneath her, the bone clearly broken. He pulled off his own scarf and began wrapping her. Shoulder, his hands moving fast but careful, the old cavalry medic training coming back to him in a flood. As he lifted her, something caught his eye. A thin, white scar, curling along her wrist like a silver snake. It was old, a story he had never known, but now it was exposed in the harsh, unforgetting cold. He remembered the long sleeves she had always worn, even in the heat of summer. He remembered her silences, the shadows in her eyes he had never understood. He held her tighter, a fierce, protective anger rising in him. He carried her to the horse, lifted Annabel to sit between them, and climbed on. The ride back was slower, more agonizing. The storm pressed close, the horse's hooves sinking deeper into the snow, and in the quiet, broken only by the wind, memory returned. She had come to town when they were both 20, half Navajo, raised by a missionary aunt after her parents died. She had worked at the saloon first, quiet and graceful, then at the dress shop. She had laughed like water over stones. She had smelled of sage and freedom. She had danced barefoot by the creek under a summer moon. He had loved her instantly, with the fierce, uncomplicated passion of a young man who had not yet known loss. His father had hated her from the start. "You'd throw away this ranch, our name, for a half-breed squaw?" The old man had spat. his face a mask of cold fury. "You do this, and you're no son of mine." Silas had pleaded, had argued. He had stood on this very porch one night, a small, simple ring in his pocket, his heart at war. And then she was gone. No warning, no note. Until weeks later, a letter had arrived in the post, the paper tear-stained and crumpled. He still had it, tucked away in a locked box, though he had never read it a second time. "Live the life you were born into, Silas. Don't come looking for me. Some love is better left buried." But love like that, he now realized, did not stay buried. Not if she had sent their child to find him. He looked down at the unconscious woman in his arms, her body cold against his chest. The storm whipped around, them biting and merciless. She had run once, he now understood, to protect him from losing everything. Now she had come back, broken and desperate, because there was no one else left. And this time, he would not let her go. Amara woke to the scent of cedar smoke, and something warm pressed against her back. She blinked, her vision blurry. The light in the room was soft and golden. A fire crackled nearby. Her shoulder ached with a dull, throbbing pain, and her leg was a fire of agony. But it was the silence that disoriented her. It was peaceful, unfamiliar. Her eyes opened fully. She saw wooden beams above, dark with age. A tin kettle was steaming gently on the hearth. A heavy wool blanket was tucked around her, too carefully, placed to be her own doing. She tried to sit up, winced, and gasped as a sharp pain shot through her leg. Footsteps approached. She turned her head and saw him. Silas. He stood in the doorway, his arms folded, leaning against the frame as if he, had been standing there for hours. His beard was longer than she remembered, his eyes deeper set, but they were the same eyes, the ones that used to make her forget the world and its troubles. "Amara," he said softly, not moving from the doorway. Her lips parted, her throat dry. "Silas, you're still here?" He nodded, never left. A silence settled between them, heavy and sacred, filled with the weight of 7 unspoken years. Her eyes welled before she could stop them. One tear traced a path through the dirt on her cheek, then another. She looked away, ashamed of her own weakness. I thought maybe you'd forget." He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the stove, poured water into a tin cup, and brought it to her. She reached for it with her good arm, her fingers, brushing his as she took it. The brief contact sent a jolt of warmth through her. "Annabel?" she whispered, her voice a raw rasp. "She's safe. Sleeping in the next room. She hasn't let go of your shawl." Amara exhaled slowly, a wave of profound relief passing over her face like sunlight through clouds. She took a sip of water, then another. "You found us," she said finally, not quite looking at him. "You sent her to me," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "She found me." Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and the years between them seemed to collapse. But neither of them reached across the space that remained. "I wrapped your leg as best I could," Silas said, stepping back, restoring. "The distance, your shoulder too. You'll need to rest." "Thank you." He gave a short, curt nod and turned away. "Silas," she said, her voice almost too soft to hear. He stopped. "I didn't know where else to go." "You came too?" "The right place," he said, his back still to her. Then he stepped out, closing the door gently behind him, leaving her alone with her pain and the ghosts of their shared past. The days that followed passed in a slow, careful rhythm. Amara healed inch by painful inch, and Silas moved around her, like a ghost, present and watchful, but never lingering too long. He fed the fire, brought her broth, and checked her bandages with a surprisingly gentle touch. Their conversations were few, careful, rehearsed. "Do you need anything?" "No, thank you." Is the pain manageable? But every now and then, their eyes would meet across the quiet room, and the things unsaid would press between them, louder than any spoken words. Amara noticed the way he limped slightly now, a wound, perhaps, from a time long ago. He noticed how she would sometimes flinch in her sleep, even when no noise disturbed her. One afternoon, Annabel came running into the room with a bundle of crumpled paper and a fistful of charcoal. "Look, Mama," she beamed. I drew our house, Amara smiled and took the paper. "It's beautiful, sweet girl." Annabel turned to Silas, who was standing in the doorway, holding out another drawing. "And this is you chopping wood. See, that's your beard." Silas actually laughed under his breath. "You got it too short." "Oops," she giggled. "Next time I'll draw it scruffier." Then she paused, looking up at Amara, then back at Silas. She tilted her head. "Can I call you?" She hesitated, her cheeks flushing. "I mean, is it okay if I call you Mr. Silas?" The room seemed to freeze. Silas opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Amara's breath caught in her throat. Annabel shifted awkwardly, looking down. "Sorry. Mama always said you were kind. I didn't mean to." "It's all right," Silas said gently, crouching beside her. "You can call me whatever feels right to you." She nodded slowly, then slipped back into her mother's arms. Amara stared at the fireplace, her eyes distant. "She's always been strong," she murmured. Silas sat on the edge of the chair. Across from her, he did not speak. He just watched the fire crackle, watched the way her eyes reflected its light like the sky just before a storm. There was so much to say, but not yet. Not tonight. The afternoon light crept through the cabin window, spilling a pale gold across the worn floorboards. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and a hush hung over the house like the quiet before a storm. Silas stood outside, the rhythmic crack of his axe on oak a dull echo in the quiet hills. Inside, Amara sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulder aching from the damp chill. She had tried to change the bandage on her shoulder herself, but her arm would not bend in the right way. She winced as the small tin of salve he had left for her slipped from her fingers, landing with a soft thud on the floor. She cursed under her breath, tried again to reach the wound, stretching her arm behind her back, biting her lip against the sharp pain. The door creaked open. "You should let someone help with that," Silas said from the doorway. She turned, sharply startled, the heavy blanket slipping from her shoulder. Her bare skin was exposed, and with it, the network of old, faded scars that marked her back, along with the fresh, angry bruises. Silas paused in the doorway, his eyes catching the edge of the scar she always tried to hide, the one that curled along her collarbone. "I can manage," she said quickly, reaching for the blanket, her face flushing with shame. But he stepped forward anyway. "Let me." Amara froze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Slowly, cautiously, he knelt beside her. His fingers were rough from work, calloused and hard, but they moved with a surprising care as he dipped them into the salve, pressing it gently into the torn skin of her shoulder. She flinched, not from the pain of the wound, but from the memory his quiet touch evoked. It was so unlike the hands she had known these past years. "Who did this to you, Amara?" Silas asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. She stared at the floor, her voice coming out flat and empty, like dust brushing across stone. "Wesley Granger." He stiffened. "The rancher from the South Valley. A man known for his wealth, his power, and his cruelty." "Granger is still alive?" "Very much so," she said, "and more powerful than before." Silas set the salve down slowly on the small table beside the bed. Amara pulled the blanket back up, clutching it to her chest. "I was young and scared," she began, the words tumbling out now, a torrent held back for too long. After I left you, I thought I could disappear, find some corner of the territory where no one knew me. But Granger found me. He offered safety, promised kindness. She gave a bitter, humorless laugh. He wanted a wife who would make him look noble, a half-Navajo bride, tamed and soft-spoken. Silas clenched his jaw so tight a muscle jumped. He never loved me, she continued, her voice a monotone of remembered pain. He owned me. I was a trophy to parade at his gatherings, a thing to dress up and then shut away. He would beat me if I spoke out of turn. He kept me locked in the back of the house most days. I was not allowed to leave the ranch, not without one of his men watching me. Silas stood, pacing to the window, his large hand gripping the frame until his knuckles were white. I tried to leave once, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. A year ago, he found me in the hills and dragged me back by my hair. Silas's voice was barely audible. And Annabelle, is she? A terrible silence filled the room. He knew she wasn't Granger's. He had seen his own eyes reflected in the girl's amber gaze. I never told him, she said, her hands trembling as she spoke. But he saw it. He saw you in her eyes, her laugh. She reminded him of everything he could never truly control. Her voice broke. He started to say things. That she would ruin his name, that people would talk. One night, he beat me until I couldn't move. Then he took Annabelle, dragged us both out to the edge of the canyon. I thought he was going to kill us. Silas turned, a look of pure horror painted across his face. But he didn't, she whispered. He left us there like garbage. Said if we ever came back, he'd finish what he started. Her eyes filled with tears again. I woke up bleeding. My leg was shattered. I told Annabelle to follow the river, to find a man named Silas Reed. I didn't even know if you were still alive. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and dropped to his knees in front of her. You came to me, he said, his voice hoarse with a pain that matched her own. I had no one else, she whispered. No one I ever trusted. He reached up, his fingers brushing her cheek, but he did not touch her. I should have fought for you, he said, back then. I should have burned his whole damn ranch down. Amara looked at him then, her eyes wide and full of something raw and vulnerable. You were young, she said, and I didn't want to be the reason you lost everything. But I lost you. He murmured that for a long moment. They said nothing. Then she whispered, barely audible, Do you blame me for not telling you about her? No, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I blame myself for giving you a reason not to. They sat there in the firelight, the years of pain and silence and misunderstanding finally collapsing between them. She closed her eyes, and he reached for her hand, holding it gently, as if it were something precious that might break. And in that stillness, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of it. The snow had melted into a muddy slush around the yard, revealing patches of brown earth and last year's dead grass. Spring came late to the Wyoming hills, but today there was sunlight thin, pale, but honest. Silas stood by the porch rail, his arms crossed, watching Annabelle near the corral. She was humming softly to herself, bent over a piece of wood, moving a stub of charcoal in careful, deliberate arcs. Her dark curls caught the light like honeyed rope. The way she scrunched up her nose when she was concentrating was the exact same way Amara used to. When she laughed at a joke only she understood, it wasn't Wesley Granger's cruel echo. It was his. He gripped the rail harder. The tilt of her head, the shape of her mouth when she smiled. These were pieces of a past he had tried to bury, to forget. Now they were alive, playing in his yard. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Amara stepped out onto the porch, a heavy shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. her limp still visible but less pronounced now. Her face was pale, still healing, but her eyes were unchanged. They were still the eyes that carried more than they. Led on. She likes the mornings, Amara said, her voice quiet. She gets that from you? They stood in a comfortable silence for a long time, watching the girl. Finally, Silas turned, his own voice low, but edged with a pain that was still raw. Amara? Is she mine? Amara stiffened, her gaze falling to the weathered porch floor. I didn't want you to feel tied to me, she said, her voice a whisper. Or to her. I knew what it would cost you back then. With your father. That's not an answer, he said, his voice tight. She took a deep breath, clutching the shawl tighter around herself. Yes, she whispered. She is. The air between them shifted, became charged with the weight of that single word. Silas looked back at Annabel, who was now drawing horses in the dirt with a stick. His daughter. How long? He asked, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. Since the first time I felt her heartbeat, Amara said. I thought about writing to you 100 times. But I kept telling myself it would ruin your life. That staying away was the only way to protect you. He turned to her then, his eyes sharp with an old, familiar anger. Protect me from what? The truth? No, she said, her voice strained. From being forced to choose. From your father's threats. From this town. From losing everything. Just like I did. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. You think I would have walked away if I had known? You walked away when it was just me. The words were a quiet accusation, a hurt she had carried for. 7 long years. That's not fair, he snapped. You left a note, and then you disappeared. What was I supposed to do? She met his gaze then, her own eyes steady despite the tremble in her hands. Your father came to me, Silas. He said he would disown you, strip you of your name, your inheritance. He offered to have me handled. If I didn't leave, I thought I was saving you. Silas fell silent. He remembered the arguments, the shouting, his father's cold, unyielding face. He remembered the silence that had followed her departure, the empty station platform, the wrinkled, tear-stained letter that had arrived weeks later. He had never asked why. He had only hurt. I didn't want Annabel to grow up afraid, Amara said, her voice dropping to a whisper. But I failed. And when he threw us out, when I thought I was going to die, I told her to find you. Because even after all these years, I believed you would try. He exhaled hard, his fists clenched at his sides. She's mine, he murmured. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a truth settling into his bones. I never meant to hide her from you, Amara said, only to protect her. Maybe I was wrong. He looked down at Annabel, who was now kneeling in the grass, arranging wildflowers in neat little rows, like a ceremony no one had taught her, but that she somehow understood. I missed 7 years, he said, the words bitter in his mouth. Can have every year after this, she whispered. He turned to her then, and something inside him, something that had been hard and frozen for a very long time, finally broke. I don't want to miss another day, he said, his voice catching. Not with her, and not with you. But Amara didn't reach for him. She just looked at him, her eyes full of truths too deep for blame and too old for easy forgiveness. Silas stepped down from the porch, crossing the yard in a few long strides. Annabel, he called softly. She looked up, her face bright. Yes, Mr. Silas. He knelt beside her in the grass. Would it be all right if I kept one of these flowers for my windowsill? She grinned and handed him the brightest one, a yellow splash of hope. Mama says the yellow ones mean a new beginning. He smiled gently, holding the small flower with a surprising care. I think your mama's right. The days lengthened, and the wind that blew down from the mountains grew warmer. Spring took a slow, gentle hold of the valley, coaxing green shoots from the hard earth and a quiet, hesitant laughter from a child's throat. Silas said little about the revelation of his daughter, but his actions spoke louder than words ever could. He repaired the broken hinge on the barn door without being asked. He replaced the cracked pane of glass in the room where Amara slept. He spent hours sharpening tools that had long been neglected, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were reshaping not just his cabin, but his entire life, from a place of waiting into a place of living. Every morning, he would split wood for the stove, stacking it neatly on the porch. Every evening, he would sweep the hearth before turning in. He never looked for thanks, and Amara never offered any. They were past that now. They were in a new, uncharted territory. Amara, for her part, watched him through the window as he built a small, sturdy bench, just the right height for Annabel, and carved her initials into the side. When it was done, he didn't present it with pride. He simply left it outside the front steps, where the little girl would find it. She did. She squealed with delight. "Mama, look! My own porch seat!" Amara smiled and turned away quickly, her eyes stinging. Later, Silas saddled his old, steady gelding and lifted Annabel gently onto the saddle. He walked beside the horse as she held the reins, one of his large, calloused hands always near in case she slipped. She shouted with a pure, unadulterated joy when the horse broke into a slow trot. "She's a natural," he told Amara that evening, rubbing the back of his neck as he returned from the barn. "She takes after someone with strong blood." Amara did not answer, but her gaze lingered on him longer than usual, a new softness in her eyes. That night she could not sleep. Her legs still throbbed in the cold. When she stirred, she found an extra pillow tucked beneath her knee, placed there so gently, while she had slept, she hadn't even noticed. On the small table beside her bed, a smooth river stone sat steaming in a bowl of hot water, a makeshift heater. She stared at it for a long time. No note, no grand gesture, just quiet, constant care. Her throat tightened. The next morning, she walked outside just after sunrise. She stopped when she saw Silas sitting cross-legged in the dirt, Annabel nestled in his lap. He was carefully, if clumsily, braiding her hair, his large fingers fumbling with the dark strands. "Too tight?" he asked. Annabel giggled. "A little." He redid the braid, more delicate this time. Amara stepped back inside before they noticed her. One evening, as dusk poured over the hills, Silas sat on the porch with his whittling knife, carving something small and curved from a piece of soft pine. Amara passed behind him on her way to gather herbs from the small garden she had started. She paused. "What are you making?" He held it up without turning. "A hair comb for Annabel, so she can feel pretty, even when things are hard." She said nothing, but that night she placed a small sprig of lavender on his workbench. Once, she found him asleep on the floor beside Annabel's bed, his hand still curled protectively around hers. The little girl was dreaming peacefully, one arm thrown over his broad chest. Amara leaned in the doorway, her hand covering her mouth. He did not stir, but she saw a single tear trace a path through the dust on his cheek. The days passed like that, quiet, intentional. They did not speak of love, but love hung in the air like the scent of pine after a rain, ever present, even if unacknowledged. Amara found herself humming again while she stirred the stew. She laughed when Annabel stuck flour in her hair. She reached for Silas's hand once by accident as they were passing in the narrow hallway, and this time she did not pull away fast enough. Still, neither of them said the words. Still, the silence was safer, until one evening she stepped outside to find him fixing the porch rail, his shirt damp with sweat, his sleeves rolled high. Why do you keep doing this? She asked quietly. All these things. He looked up from his work. Because I want you both to stay, she swallowed. That's not an answer. He stood slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers. It's the only one I have. And he walked past her into the house. She stood there for a long time, staring at the sky, her fingers shaking, her heart rising and falling like a breath held too long. The wind shifted that morning. Silas noticed it first, the way the horses grew restless in the corral, their ears twitching toward the southern trail. The birds in the cottonwoods had gone quiet. Even the pine trees on the ridge seemed to brace themselves. Then came the dust. 4 riders. He stepped off the porch, his rifle already in hand, and narrowed his eyes as the figures drew closer. At the lead, slouched in a black coat that gleamed like tar, rode Wesley Granger. Beside him were his hired guns, mean-looking and saddle-worn. The kind of men who followed coin more than any cause. Silas stood his ground as they reined in, a smug grin stretching across Granger's face like rot-on fruit. "Reed," he drawled, "I see you've been playing house." Silas's voice was as cold as ice. "Turn around, Granger. You're not welcome here." Granger dismounted, tossing the reins aside as if he owned the very soil beneath his boots. "You've got something that belongs to me." "You have nothing here," Silas replied. Granger sneered. "My wife and my daughter. She was never yours." The voice came from the doorway. Amara stepped onto the porch, her spine straight despite the tremor in her leg. She held Annabel close behind her, one hand resting protectively on the child's shoulder. Granger's eyes narrowed. "I see the squaw can still speak," he said. "I thought I had fixed that last time." Silas moved to stand between them. "You speak to her again like that, and you'll be eating your words. One tooth at a time." Granger raised a hand, and 2 of his men drew their weapons. Amara gasped and pulled Annabel tighter behind her. The moment cracked. Silas lunged first, not with his rifle, but with his fists, knocking one gunman sideways with a brutal blow. The second man fired, the bullet grazing Silas's arm. Then chaos. Wood splintered. Horses screamed. A blade flashed, catching Silas in the shoulder. A deep, hot pain bloomed down his side. He stumbled, but didn't fall. Granger reached for Amara. "You think you can hide from me forever?" She slapped his hand away. "She is not yours." He struck her hard across the face. Annabel screamed. Silas roared, a sound of pure primal rage. He tackled Granger, and both men slammed into the porch rail, fists flying. Blood smeared the weathered wood. Granger drew a knife, driving it toward Silas's chest, but Amara snatched a heavy iron shovel from the wall and swung it with all her might. The blade cracked against Granger's side. He dropped the knife, cursing. Silas seized the fallen knife, pressing the tip to Granger's throat. "Go ahead," Granger spat, blood trickling from his mouth. "Kill me. See how long. It takes the law to find you." Silas didn't blink. "I am the law out here." But before he could move, a crowd began to gather. Neighbors, other ranchers, even some folks from town, all drawn by the sounds of the gunfight. Among them was the sheriff, flanked by 2 deputies. "Enough!" The sheriff barked, his rifle leveled. "Everyone stand down." Amara stepped forward, her lip bleeding, but a fire of righteous fury in her eyes. "I have something to say." The crowd hushed. "This man," she said, pointing a trembling finger at Granger, "is no husband. He is a slaver, a trafficker. He has been moving people across this territory, native women, orphans, under the guise of charity." Murmurs rippled through. The crowd. "He beat me, locked me away, threatened to kill my child, and now he wants her back so he can preserve his good name." She turned to the sheriff. "You can check his ranch. In the cellar. He keeps ledgers, and cages. The sheriff glanced at his deputy, who nodded grimly. And Amara looked at the people, at the neighbors who had once averted their gaze. "Annabel," she said, her voice loud and clear, "is the daughter of Silas Red, and I am no man's property." Silence. Then a voice spoke up from the crowd. "We've seen Granger's wagons moving late at night." "No cargo," another chimed in. "My cousin's girl disappeared last spring. She worked for him. The tide had turned." The sheriff stepped forward. "Wesley Granger, you're under arrest. Hands up." The hired gunmen hesitated, but the sight of a dozen rifles aimed their way broke their resolve. They dropped their weapons. Granger stood frozen, his face a mask of fury. "You think this makes you free?" He snarled at Amara. "I was never yours to own," she said. Silas drifted in and out of a fevered sleep for 3 days. The wound on his shoulder was deep, and infection had tried to take root. But Amara sat beside him through every hour, wiping his brow with cool, damp cloths, whispering words only his heart could hear. Annabel curled up by the foot of the bed, too afraid to leave, as if any distance might break the fragile spell of his breathing. Amara knew the old ways. She steeped bitter roots in boiling water and crushed wild leaves too. Draw out the poison. She whispered prayers in Navajo under her breath, the same ones her mother had once whispered over her when she was a child. On the 4th night, he opened his eyes. His gaze was clear. "You stayed," he murmured. "Of course," she whispered, her hand finding his. "I don't know what happens next," he said, his voice weak but steady. "But if you'll let me, I'd like to be your husband, to be her father, not just in name, in truth." Amara's eyes filled with tears. "I forgave you," she said, her voice trembling, "the moment I told her to find you." He smiled, faintly, his fingers brushing her cheek. "Then let's begin again, not from the past, from now." She nodded, pressing her forehead to his, their breath mingling between them. Outside, the wind had shifted again, but this time it carried the scent of spring. Wesley Granger was taken into custody days later. The charges were quiet but damning. Whispers from the townsfolk, a sheriff's raid, a stack of ledgers that spoke louder than any confession. His empire crumbled under the weight of secrets he had buried for too long. And then it was over. No more running. No more hiding. The cabin changed slowly, lovingly. The porch was repaired, painted with a leftover whitewash Silas had stored. For years. A garden bloomed near the fence wildflowers Amara had planted by hand, herbs tucked between the stones. Annabel chose the colors, blue and yellow, like the sky and the sun. Laughter returned to the small homestead, not as a guest, but as a permanent resident. Silas built Annabel a swing from an old wagon wheel and a length of sturdy rope. She would soar over the field, squealing with joy as the wind caught her. Dress. Amara would hang laundry in the sun, her hair braided, her smile unguarded. She sang again, sometimes in English, sometimes in Navajo. And when she sang, Silas would pause whatever he was doing, just to listen. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch together, watching the light stretch long across the valley, his arm wrapped around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. They did not speak much of the past, not because it still hurt, but because the present was finally enough. One morning, Annabel burst into the cabin, her cheeks flushed, her hair full of grass. "Mama, Papa, come see." They followed her outside. The field had bloomed overnight. Poppies, daisies, and bluebells were scattered like confetti across the hills. The wind moved through them like a hymn. She pointed to the far end of the meadow where her pony waited, the reins draped over the fence. "Watch me ride," she shouted. And she did, galloping through the wildflowers, laughing like the world had never known a single moment of darkness. Silas. wrapped an arm around Amara's waist, pulling her close. "She's free," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Yes," Amara replied, tears rising again, not from pain this time, but from something so full it almost hurt. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "So are we." She nodded. They stood in silence, watching their daughter fly across the earth like wind made flesh. Inside the cabin, tucked away in a drawer that had once been filled with regret, sat a new letter. It was written in Silas's hand, addressed simply for her someday, and it read, "Wherever your heart returns, my love, know that I am there. A home is not made from wood or stone. A home is where two people choose each other, again and again, where laughter echoes even after tears, where bullets missed but hearts never did. Where the heart returns, that is home.